The night air in Appalachia carries weight. Not metaphorically, but literally, thick with coal dust and the kind of dread that settles into your lungs like black lung disease. This is West Virginia in 1967, where the mountains hold secrets and the mines hold bodies. Deep inside the abandoned Blackthorn No. 7 mine, a man screams into the darkness. His name is Elijah Crow, third-generation coal miner, and his voice echoes off tunnel walls that haven't seen living souls in months. "I know you're in there, demon." His shotgun trembles in his calloused hands. Coal dust covers him from head to boot, but underneath that grime is something more dangerous than dirt. It's rage. Pure, concentrated, the kind that burns hotter than any lantern flame. Something moves in the shadows. Not fast, not aggressive. Just tired. The ground trembles. Small stones cascade from the ceiling. And then, cutting through the absolute blackness of that forsaken tunnel, two eyes appear. Red as warning lights. Red as fresh blood. Red as the anger that's been eating Elijah alive for 6 long months. But here's the thing nobody tells you about those eyes. They're not hungry. They're not evil. They're exhausted. Defeated. Like they've seen every tragedy coming and couldn't stop a single one. Elijah raises his weapon. His finger tightens on the trigger. Everything he's believed, everything he's hated, everything that's kept him awake screaming into his pillow at 3 in the morning, it all comes down to this moment. Cut to black. Everyone thought the Mothman was a harbinger of death. A creature that appeared before disaster, marking communities for destruction like some twisted biblical plague. But nobody, not a single soul in all of Appalachia, imagined what happens when death itself comes looking for him. When a man consumed by vengeance tracks down the thing he blames for losing everything. When the hunter becomes the hunted, and the monster becomes something else entirely. This is that story. And like all true Appalachian tales, it's darker than the bottom of a sealed mine shaft, stranger than the lights that dance over the ridges at midnight, and more human than you'd ever expect. Let's talk about Elijah Crow. Not the broken man screaming in a mine, but the man he used to be. Born in 1939, Elijah grew up in a company town where your future was determined the day your daddy first took you down into the earth. The Crow family had been miners since before anyone bothered keeping records. His grandfather died in a shaft collapse in 1923. His father lost 3 fingers to a conveyor belt malfunction in 1951. And his older brother, Samuel, the golden child who could find coal seems like a divining rod finds water, Samuel was supposed to be different. In Appalachia, hope is a luxury item, more expensive than whiskey and twice as dangerous. But Elijah had hope. Because Samuel was smart. Samuel was careful. Samuel knew those tunnels better than the company engineers who'd never set foot below ground. On March 14, 1967, Samuel Crow descended into Blackthorn No. 9 for his morning shift. 11 hours later, they pulled his body from under 3 tons of collapsed ceiling. He was 29 years old. Left behind a wife, 2 kids, and a brother who would never be the same. Now here's where the local legend intersects with personal tragedy. 3 days before the collapse, half a dozen miners reported seeing something near the mine entrance. Something massive. Something with wings that shouldn't exist on any creature that size. Red eyes that watched from the tree-line. A shape that moved wrong, like it existed slightly outside of normal physics. The Mothman. In Appalachia, when you see a thing with wings too large for any bird, you've got 2 choices. You either become a preacher and call it an angel, or you become an alcoholic and call it delirium tremens. Elijah Crow chose option 3. He called it the enemy. He called it the killer. He called it the reason his brother was dead. The Mothman sightings around Point Pleasant and the surrounding counties had been increasing since late 1966. Witnesses described a creature standing 6 to 7 feet tall, humanoid but distinctly not human, with enormous moth-like wings folded against its back. Those red eyes, always those red eyes, glowing with their own internal light. Some said it could fly at impossible speeds. Others claimed it could appear and disappear like smoke. A few swore it could read minds, project thoughts, show you things that hadn't happened yet. Most importantly, everyone agreed on one thing. When the Mothman appeared, disaster followed. Sometimes within days. Sometimes within hours. It became a harbinger, a death omen, the Appalachian Grim Reaper with wings instead of a scythe. But what if everyone was wrong? What if correlation isn't causation? What if the Mothman wasn't causing the tragedies, but trying desperately, helplessly, to prevent them? Consider this. A creature that can sense structural instability, detect dangerous gas buildups, feel seismic vibrations before they become disasters. A being that appears near mines with failing support beams, bridges with corroded cables, buildings with compromised foundations. Not to cause harm, but to warn. To scream into the void of human ignorance and pray someone, anyone, listens. An angel rejected by the very people it's trying to save. Condemned to watch tragedy after tragedy unfold, blamed for the very disasters it appears to prevent. That's not a monster. That's a curse. That's torture wearing wings. And nobody, absolutely nobody, believed it. Least of all Elijah Crow, who'd spent 6 months transforming grief into a weapon. The tip came on a Tuesday. Anonymous, naturally. A folded note slipped under Elijah's trailer door while he was passed out drunk on his sofa, still wearing yesterday's clothes and tomorrow's regrets. The demon hides in Blackthorn 7. End it. No signature. No explanation. Just an address to revenge written in pencil on cheap paper. Blackthorn No. 7 was one of the oldest mines in the region, sealed in 1954 after a methane explosion killed 8 men. The company decided it was cheaper to abandon the site than fix the ventilation problems. They filled in the main entrance with concrete and posted warning signs that had long since rusted into illegibility. Everyone knew you didn't go near Blackthorn 7. The ground was unstable. The air was toxic. The ghosts were vengeful. Perfect place for a demon to hide, Elijah thought as he loaded his pickup truck with everything he'd need. A shotgun that had belonged to his grandfather. 3 sticks of dynamite he'd quietly stolen from the mining company's poorly guarded supply shed. A battery-powered lantern. A flask of whiskey that was definitely not for courage because Elijah Crow didn't need courage, he needed closure. The drive took 40 minutes on back roads that had been bad in the 1950s and hadn't improved since. Trees crowded close on both sides, bare branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. November in West Virginia means the world is dying slowly, everything turning gray and brown and the color of old bones. The kind of landscape that makes you understand why people see monsters. Elijah parked half a mile from the sealed mine entrance. Hiked the rest of the way with his gear strapped to his back like he was going to war. In his mind, he was. This wasn't hunting. This was justice. This was settling a debt written in his brother's blood. The concrete barrier sealing the main entrance had cracked over 13 years of weather and neglect. Not enough for a person to squeeze through, but enough to reveal that something had been coming and going. The edges of the crack were worn smooth. Fresh scrape marks suggested recent activity. Something lived here. Something large. Elijah found a side entrance, an old ventilation shaft that the company had forgotten to seal. The metal grate had been torn away from the inside, twisted like tissue paper. The tunnel beyond descended at a steep angle, disappearing into darkness so complete it seemed to have physical mass. He clicked on his lantern. Checked his shotgun one more time. Took a long pull from his flask. And descended into the earth. The air changed immediately. Cold, damp, heavy with that distinctive mineral smell of deep underground. The tunnel walls showed signs of both age and recent use. Old timber supports, half-rotted, some reinforced with what looked like woven branches. Patches where the ceiling had been shored up with stones arranged in careful patterns. Someone, or something, was maintaining this place, keeping it from total collapse. The tunnel branched. Then branched again. Elijah marked his path with chalk, an old miner's habit that might be the only thing keeping him alive. The sounds changed as he went deeper. His footsteps echoed strangely. The air moved in ways that suggested large open spaces ahead. And then he saw them. The marks. Not claw marks, though that's what he expected. These were symbols. Scratched into the rock with careful precision. Geometric patterns that looked almost like writing. Warning signs. Danger markers. The kind of thing you'd leave if you desperately needed someone to understand something but couldn't speak their language. The ground trembled. Just slightly. Barely enough to notice. Dust fell from the ceiling in thin streams, illuminated by his lantern like inverted rain. Elijah's hand tightened on his shotgun. His heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to run, to get the hell out of this death trap while he still could. Instead, he moved forward. Because pain is easier to carry than uncertainty. Because revenge has its own terrible momentum once you start rolling downhill. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Natural cave formation, not something the mining company had dug. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like stone teeth. The floor was uneven, scattered with rubble and something else. Feathers. Enormous feathers, each one easily 3 feet long, black as midnight and iridescent in the lantern light. Movement in the shadows. A shape too large to be a man, too aware to be an animal. And then he stepped into the light. The Mothman. 7 feet tall if he was an inch. Humanoid body covered in what looked like fur or fine feathers, that strange in-between texture that your brain can't quite categorize. Wings folded against his back, damaged, one of them showing burn marks and missing feathers. His chest rose and fell with labored breathing. And those eyes. God, those eyes. Red as warning lights, glowing with their own bioluminescence, but not aggressive. Not threatening. They looked sad. They looked tired. They looked like they'd seen too much and saved too little. The creature didn't attack. He retreated. Stepping backward into the deeper shadows, wings folding tighter against his body in what could only be described as a defensive posture. But Elijah Crow had spent 6 months building a narrative where this creature was the villain. His mind couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. The retreat looked like a threat assessment. The defensive posture looked like preparation for attack. The sad eyes looked like predatory calculation. He raised his shotgun. "You killed my brother, you son of a bitch." The Mothman's eyes widened. A sound emerged from somewhere deep in his chest, not quite a voice but not animal either. Something between a word and a warning and a plea. And then the ground shook harder. Real tremor this time, strong enough to send Elijah stumbling. The ceiling groaned. Stones fell. And the Mothman moved, fast as lightning, lunging forward. Elijah fired. The shotgun blast echoed like thunder in the enclosed space, a sound so loud it seemed to physically push against Elijah's chest. The shot went wide, thank God or fate or the trembling hands of a man who'd drunk too much and slept too little. Buckshot sprayed across the cave wall, sparking off stone. But the ricochet did something unexpected. It struck a support beam, old and rotten, causing it to crack and fall. And behind where that beam had been, hidden for God knows how long, was another tunnel. Smaller. Older. Not part of the mining company's network at all. The Mothman had been lunging not to attack, but to push Elijah away from a section of floor that had started to crack under his weight. Now the creature stood frozen, wings partially extended, head tilted toward that newly revealed passage. That sound came again from his chest, more urgent this time. Elijah stumbled backward, reloading with shaking hands. "Stay back. I swear to God, I'll." But the Mothman wasn't paying attention to him anymore. The creature moved toward the new tunnel, paused, looked back at Elijah with those glowing red eyes, then looked at the tunnel again. The message was clear even across species. "Come see this. Come understand." "Like hell," Elijah muttered. But his curiosity, that dangerous human trait that gets us killed in horror movies and leads to scientific discoveries in equal measure, it was stronger than his hatred. Barely. By the thinnest margin. He followed, keeping his shotgun trained on the creature's back. The new tunnel was different from the mining company's work. The walls were smoother, carved with the same geometric symbols he'd seen before. But these were older, much older, and more elaborate. They covered every available surface in intricate patterns that seemed to flow and connect like some kind of ancient writing system. Indigenous tunnel work, Elijah realized with a start. The tribes that lived here before the miners, before the coal companies, before West Virginia was even West Virginia. They'd carved deep into these mountains for reasons that had nothing to do with coal. The air quality changed as they went deeper. Elijah's lantern flame flickered. His lungs started to burn. Methane. Natural gas seeping from deep deposits, colorless and odorless and absolutely deadly in high concentrations. One spark in the wrong place and this whole section would explode like a bomb. The Mothman moved more urgently now, and Elijah noticed something. The creature was deliberately positioning himself to stay between Elijah and the most dangerous-looking sections of tunnel. When Elijah started to step on an area where the floor showed hairline cracks, the Mothman would shift his position, blocking the path until Elijah chose a different route. "He's protecting me," Elijah thought, and immediately dismissed it. Monsters don't protect. Demons don't guide. This was a trick, a trap, The tunnel opened into another chamber, and Elijah's thoughts stopped completely. This was a secondary cave system the mining company had never found. Or if they'd found it, they'd kept it secret. The walls showed clear evidence of geological instability. Massive cracks running floor to ceiling. Support structures made of stone that had been here long before the mines, now buckling under pressure from above. And everywhere, those warning symbols carved deep into the rock. But that's not what stopped Elijah's breath in his chest. On the far wall, preserved by the dry air and stable temperature, were wooden boards. Company boards. Posted with notices and reports and technical documents, all yellowed with age but still legible. Blackthorn No. 9 Structural Assessment. Dated 3 months before the collapse that killed Samuel Crow. Elijah's hands shook as he approached. His lantern light fell across words that would change everything. Critical instability detected in main shaft section 7C, support beams showing 67% degradation. Recommend immediate evacuation and reinforcement. Estimated timeline to catastrophic failure, 90 to 120 days. The report was signed by a company engineer. Stamped as received by management. Filed as reviewed and acknowledged. They knew. The bastards knew the tunnel was going to collapse. They knew, and they sent the miners down anyway because stopping production would cost money, would require shutting down the most profitable shaft, would hurt the quarterly earnings report. More documents. Internal memos. Cost-benefit analyses that coldly calculated whether it was cheaper to reinforce the tunnel or pay the death benefits to however many miners would die when it inevitably collapsed. Spoiler alert, death was cheaper. Elijah's vision blurred. Not from gas inhalation, though that was definitely becoming a problem. From tears of rage so pure it felt like his body was burning from the inside out. His brother. His smart, careful, beloved brother hadn't died because of an accident. Hadn't died because of bad luck or fate or some cosmic injustice. He died because a room full of men in suits decided his life was worth less than their profit margin. And they'd blamed it on the Mothman. When the creature appeared days before the collapse, trying desperately to warn everyone, screaming in its own inhuman way that death was coming, they'd chased it off with guns and lights and curses. Called it a demon. Called it an omen. Never once considered it might be trying to help. A sound behind him. Elijah spun, shotgun raised, but the Mothman hadn't moved. The creature stood in the tunnel entrance, watching. Waiting. And now Elijah could read the expression in those red eyes. Not threat. Not hunger. Sadness. Deep, profound sadness. The look of someone who's tried to save people 100 times and failed 100 times and knows they're about to fail again. The ground shook. Harder this time. Much harder. Rocks fell from the ceiling. The cracks in the walls widened visibly. That hollow groaning sound that every experienced miner knows means the earth is about to give way. And Elijah understood. This chamber, this entire section of tunnels, it was all about to collapse. Not in days or weeks. Now. Right now. The tremors were getting stronger. The methane levels were rising. And above them, half a mile of solid mountain was deciding whether to stay up or come down. If this section collapsed, it wouldn't be like the accident that killed Samuel. This was bigger. Much bigger. The geological survey maps Elijah had seen at the mining company showed that Blackthorn 7 sat at a critical junction point. If the cave system under it failed, it would trigger a chain reaction. Multiple tunnels would collapse. Gas would ignite. The resulting explosion would be felt for miles. And directly above Blackthorn 7, less than a quarter mile of rock, sat Colville. Population 3,247. Every man, woman, and child Elijah had ever known. The Mothman made that sound again, more urgent, more desperate. Not words but meaning. A message transmitted through pure emotion, through some kind of psychic connection that Elijah's rational mind couldn't explain but his gut understood perfectly. He's been trying to prevent this. Not just today. 4 weeks. Maybe months. That's why he's here. That's why he's been maintaining the tunnels, shoring up support structures, trying to keep everything from falling apart just a little bit longer. Hoping someone would listen. Someone would understand. Someone would do what needed to be done. But nobody listened. Nobody ever listened. Another tremor. The lantern fell from Elijah's hands, glass shattering, plunging them into darkness except for those red eyes glowing in the black. And then light. Not from a lantern. From the Mothman himself. Those eyes brightening until they illuminated the chamber in crimson light. And more than light. Images. Memories. Not spoken or shown but transmitted directly into Elijah's consciousness like someone had plugged a movie projector into his brain. He saw the Mothman 3 days before the collapse. Saw him standing at the entrance to Blackthorn 9, wings spread wide, eyes blazing with warning light. Saw the miners arriving for the morning shift, pointing, shouting, some of them raising rifles. Saw the creature trying to block the entrance, trying to keep them out, trying to communicate the only way he knew how that death waited below. Saw Samuel Crow pushing past. Samuel hadn't seen the Mothman. He'd been too focused on getting to work, supporting his family, doing his duty as a third-generation miner. He'd walked right past salvation and straight into his grave. The vision shifted. Elijah saw weeks earlier. The Mothman at a bridge over the Ohio River, standing on the girders at midnight, trying to attract attention to the corroded cables that would fail 3 days later, sending a school bus into the icy water below. Saw him at a chemical plant, circling the smokestack that would crack and leak poison gas. Saw him at a dozen disasters, 100 near misses, always too late, always blamed, never understood. Saw him here, now, in these tunnels, working alone in the dark to prevent a catastrophe that would make the Silver Bridge collapse look like a minor accident. Shoring up walls with stones. Diverting water that would weaken foundations. Trying desperately to buy enough time for someone, anyone, to discover what the mining company had hidden. The vision ended. Elijah gasped, returning to his body, to the dark, to the shaking ground and falling rocks and the sick certainty that they were both about to die. "Why?" he managed to choke out. "Why do you do this? Why keep trying when nobody believes you?" The Mothman tilted his head. Those eyes dimmed slightly, and for just a moment, Elijah could swear the creature looked almost human. Broken. Exhausted. But still here. Still trying. Because that's what you do when you can see tragedy coming. You don't give up. You don't stop trying. Even when it costs you everything. Even when you're blamed for the very disasters you're trying to prevent. You keep fighting because the alternative is watching people die when you could have saved them. A massive tremor. The entire chamber shifted. Cracks raced across the ceiling like lightning in stone. They had minutes at best. Elijah's mind raced through his options, each one worse than the last. They could run. Try to make it back through the tunnels before everything collapsed. But the tremors were getting worse by the second, and the methane levels were already high enough to make his head swim. One spark, one moment of bad luck, and they'd both be vaporized. They could stay and hope the cave system held. But the engineering reports had been clear. This wasn't a question of if, it was when. And when was approximately 5 minutes from now. Or there was option 3. The option that occurred to him as he looked at the 3 sticks of dynamite still strapped to his belt. The dynamite he'd brought to kill a monster. The dynamite that might be the only thing that could save a town. The main support column, Elijah said aloud, thinking through the geology. The one holding this junction. If we collapse it in a controlled way, seal off this chamber from the rest of the system, would that stop the chain reaction? The Mothman's eyes brightened. Not quite agreement, but acknowledgement. It might work. It was better than nothing. It was the only plan they had. "Show me where," Elijah said. "Show me where to place the charges." What happened next would later be impossible for Elijah to explain coherently. The Mothman didn't speak, couldn't speak in any conventional sense. But meaning flowed between them like water finding its level. Images. Concepts. Understanding without words. The creature moved deeper into the chamber, toward the far wall where the largest of the support columns rose from floor to ceiling. Natural stone formation, limestone probably, that had been here for millions of years before humans decided to dig beneath it. Cracks already showed along its base. Under the right pressure, with the right force applied at the right points, it would shear off cleanly. Bring down this chamber. Seal it off. Stop the collapse from spreading. Kill anyone still inside, of course. But save 3,000 people sleeping in their beds above. Elijah pulled out the dynamite. His hands had stopped shaking. Strange how clarity comes in the worst moments. How purpose can make you calm even when you're about to die. "I'm sorry," he said as he began setting the charges. Not sure if he was apologizing to the Mothman or to his brother's memory or to himself. "I'm sorry I didn't understand. I'm sorry I blamed you. I'm sorry it took me so goddamn long to see what you were trying to do." The Mothman watched him work. Occasionally those eyes would pulse brighter, and Elijah would know, just know, that he needed to adjust the placement slightly left, go deeper into the crack, angle the charge upward instead of straight. The ground shook almost continuously now. Each tremor stronger than the last. Rocks the size of fists falling from the ceiling. The sound of stone grinding against stone, that deep bass frequency that you feel in your bones rather than hear with your ears. Elijah placed the last charge. Unspooled the wire back toward the tunnel entrance. The blasting cap felt tiny in his rough hands, so small a thing to hold so much destructive power. "When I trigger this," he said, "we've got maybe 30 seconds before the ceiling comes down. You can fly, right? Get yourself out. The Mothman's response wasn't words but pure emotion transmitted directly into Elijah's skull. Those wings were damaged. Burned in some previous disaster he'd tried to prevent. He could glide maybe, for short distances, but carrying extra weight? Through a collapsing tunnel system? Impossible. Then we're both dead, Elijah said flatly. Surprised by how okay he was with that. 6 months ago, he'd wanted to die. Wanted to follow his brother into whatever comes next because living without Samuel felt like drowning slowly on dry land. He'd drunk himself toward that death, driven himself toward it with reckless mining practices and picking fights in bars and every form of passive suicide you could manage without actually pulling a trigger. But this? This was different. This was dying for something instead of dying from something. This was making his life mean something in its last moments. Guess we've both been trying to save people who didn't want to be saved, Elijah said. Guess that makes us even. He positioned himself at the detonator. Double-checked the wire connections. Closed his eyes and thought about Samuel. About their childhood racing through these mountains. About the last time they'd laughed together, 2 days before the collapse, joking about getting old and going soft. About all the words left unsaid because you always think you have more time. Elijah opened his eyes. Do it, he said to the Mothman. Whatever you need to do to get clear, do it now. But the creature didn't move toward the exit. Instead, he moved toward Elijah. Those massive wings unfolded despite the damage, despite the pain that was obvious in every movement. The Mothman positioned himself behind Elijah, wings wrapping around them both like a cocoon. Like a shield. Like a parent protecting a child. Understanding hit Elijah like a physical blow. The creature wasn't running. Wasn't saving himself. He was using his body as a buffer. Those wings, dense and powerful despite their injuries, might absorb just enough of the blast force. Might give them both a chance. A tiny one. But a chance. You stupid brave son of a bitch, Elijah whispered. He pressed the detonator. The world exploded. 3 sticks of dynamite detonating in an enclosed space doesn't sound like the movies. It's not dramatic. It's instant pressure, instant heat, instant violence. The sound comes after the damage, an afterthought to devastation. The support column shattered exactly as planned. Thousands of tons of limestone dropping like a stone guillotine. The chamber ceiling followed immediately, the chain reaction of geological failure happening faster than thought. But the Mothman's wings had absorbed the initial blast wave. Elijah felt heat and pressure and pain, but nothing immediately lethal. The creature was already moving, wings pumping in desperate arrhythmic beats, carrying them both up and back toward the tunnel entrance as the floor beneath them ceased to exist. They flew. Sort of. More like controlled falling with style. The Mothman's damaged wing couldn't provide proper lift, so they spiraled and bounced off tunnel walls, caroming like a pinball through collapsing stone corridors. Behind them, the sound of a mountain eating itself. Ahead, darkness and the narrowing chance of survival. Elijah lost track of time. Might have been 30 seconds. Might have been 30 minutes. Pain and terror make a poor clock. He was aware of rock scraping his back. Of the Mothman's labored breathing. Of his own voice screaming though he couldn't remember deciding to scream. And then cold air. Real air. November wind cutting through the methane and dust and death. They emerged from a ventilation shaft Elijah didn't remember entering. Emerged and tumbled and crashed into the mountainside 40 feet below the entrance. The Mothman managed to slow their fall just enough that they survived the impact. Just barely. Elijah lay in the dirt, every part of his body screaming. Couldn't tell what was broken and what just felt broken. Didn't matter. They were alive. Against all probability and logic and sense, they were alive. Behind them, the mountain groaned. A massive subterranean collapse. But controlled. Sealed. The chain reaction stopped before it could reach the active mines. Before it could reach Colville. The Mothman had landed a few yards away. One wing was clearly broken now, bent at an angle that made Elijah's stomach turn. The creature's breathing came in ragged gasps. Those red eyes dimmed to barely visible embers. "You're hurt," Elijah said stupidly. Like that wasn't obvious. Like they weren't both hovering between alive and dead, held to life by nothing but stubborn refusal to quit. The Mothman's eyes pulsed once. Something that might have been acknowledgement or might have been goodbye. "Wait," Elijah said. "I need to tell people. About what you did. About what you've been trying to do. They need to know you're not." But even as he spoke, even as he tried to drag himself across the ground toward the creature, the Mothman was moving. Dragging himself toward the tree line with that broken wing trailing behind. Moving away. Disappearing. "Please," Elijah called. "Let me help you. Let me." The red eyes looked back one final time. And Elijah understood, with the same wordless clarity they'd shared in the tunnels, what the creature was telling him. Some things can't be explained. Can't be proven. Some truths are too strange for people to accept. If Elijah tried to tell the truth, tried to explain what really happened, they'd call him crazy. Traumatized. A drunk miner who got caught in a collapse and invented a story to cope with the horror. But he could change things in other ways. He could make sure the truth about the mining company's negligence came out. Could fight for safety regulations. Could honor the Mothman's sacrifice by saving future lives the slow, bureaucratic, unglamorous way that actually changes systems. That was the deal. Unspoken but binding. The Mothman would disappear back into legend. And Elijah would do the real work of prevention. The creature vanished into the darkness. A shadow between shadows. Gone. Elijah lay in the snow that had started to fall and realized he was crying. Not from pain, though God knows there was plenty of that. From something else. Something he hadn't felt in 6 months. Relief. Purpose. The strange peace that comes from doing the right thing even when it costs you everything. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, dawn was breaking and there were voices. Search and rescue. Someone had felt the tremors, had seen the dust cloud, had come looking for survivors. They found Elijah Crow half frozen and broken on the mountainside below Blackthorn 7. Found him and carried him out and hospitalized him with multiple fractures and exposure and lungs damaged by methane inhalation. They did not find anyone else. Did not find evidence of a 7-foot creature with wings and red eyes. Found only one man's tracks in the snow. When he could finally speak, Elijah told them about the documents in the chamber. Told them where to dig. Made sure they recovered the evidence of the mining company's culpability. Made sure someone paid for Samuel's death and all the other deaths that could have been prevented. He didn't mention the Mothman. Kept that secret locked behind his teeth like a promise. And if people wondered how a drunk miner stumbled onto that evidence. If they questioned how he knew exactly where to place explosives to prevent a catastrophic collapse. If they speculated about the strange wing-shaped bruises across his back that the doctors couldn't explain. Well. Appalachia is full of mysteries. Some questions don't need answers. 3 weeks later, Elijah Crow checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice. He could walk, mostly. Could breathe, barely. Still heard the sound of collapsing tunnels in his sleep. Still woke up screaming some nights, convinced he was drowning in coal dust and darkness. But he was alive. And that meant he had work to do. The documents recovered from the sealed chamber had done their job. The mining company's stock had plummeted. Federal investigators were crawling through their records like termites through rotten wood. 3 executives had already been indicted for criminal negligence. More would follow. But Elijah knew that wasn't enough. Punishing the guilty after people died, that was justice. Prevention, stopping deaths before they happened, that was harder. That required changing the entire system. Changing how mines operated. How safety was prioritized. How workers' lives were valued. That required the kind of unglamorous, grinding, bureaucratic warfare that doesn't make for good stories but actually saves lives. So Elijah became something he never imagined he'd be. An activist. An advocate. A voice for the voiceless miners who went into the earth every day knowing the companies cared more about profits than their lives. He testified before Congress. Spoke at union meetings. Helped draft legislation that would become the Coal Mine Health and Safety Act. Pushed for mandatory inspections, ventilation requirements, worker protections that had teeth instead of vague suggestions. People listened to him because he'd been there. Had coal dust in his lungs and scars on his hands and no financial incentive to lie. He was one of them. When Elijah Crow said mines were dangerous, people believed him. He never mentioned the Mothman. Never talked about red eyes in the darkness or wings that broke to save his life. But sometimes, late at night when he was working on testimony or reviewing safety reports, he'd think about that creature. Wonder if he was still out there. Still trying to warn people. Still being blamed for disasters he desperately wanted to prevent. Elijah's trailer became a headquarters of sorts. Union organizers. Safety inspectors. Journalists looking for the human interest angle. They all passed through, drawn by this rough-spoken miner who'd survived an impossible collapse and come out the other side determined to change the world. "You're different," one reporter said during an interview. "Most men who survive something like that, they either drink themselves to death or never go near a mine again. You're fighting harder than ever." Why? Elijah thought about that question for a long moment. Thought about Samuel. Thought about red eyes in the dark. Thought about the weight of a promise made to someone who couldn't even speak. "Because somebody's got to," he finally said. "Because every miner that goes home safe to his family, that's worth fighting for. Because the only thing worse than a tragedy is a tragedy that could have been prevented." The reporter wrote it down like it was profound. Elijah knew it was just the truth. Years passed. The Coal Mine Health and Safety Act became law in 1969. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. Measurably better. Mine deaths dropped. Safety violations had real consequences. The culture shifted, slowly, toward valuing life over quarterly profits. Elijah Crow could claim some credit for that. Not all of it, not even most of it, but enough. Enough to know that his brother's death had meant something. That his own survival had a purpose. He never went back to mining. Couldn't. His lungs were too damaged, his body too broken. But he stayed in Coalville. Stayed in Appalachia. This was his home. These were his people. The mountains held too much history, too much pain, too much beauty to abandon. And on certain nights, when the wind moved through the hollows just right and the darkness felt particularly heavy, Elijah would stand outside his trailer and look toward the ridgeline. Looking for lights that shouldn't exist. Looking for a silhouette with wings. He never saw anything. The Mothman had vanished as completely as smoke in a strong wind. Back to whatever strange corner of reality he'd emerged from. Back to his endless, thankless work of trying to save people who would never know they needed saving. But Elijah knew. Would always know. And that knowledge changed everything. 23 years later. December 1990. Elijah Crow was 61 years old, his hair gone gray, his body a catalog of old injuries that predicted the weather better than any meteorologist. He'd outlived his doctor's expectations by 2 decades. Still lived in that same trailer in Coalville. Still fought for mine safety, though the battles had changed as the coal industry itself changed. He'd never married. Never had children. Some men are defined by their families. Others are defined by their purpose. Elijah fell firmly into the latter category. But he wasn't alone. The community had adopted him as a fixture, a piece of living history. The old miner who'd somehow survived Blackthorn 7. Who'd helped bring down a corrupt mining company. Who'd changed the laws that kept them all safer. Young miners would stop by his trailer sometimes, asking for advice. Asking about the old days. Elijah would tell them stories, leaving out certain details, focusing on the practical lessons. Stay alert. Trust your instincts. Never let the company put profits over your life. On this particular December evening, cold enough to hurt your lungs, Elijah sat on his small porch with a blanket over his knees and hot coffee in his hands. The doctors said the coffee was bad for him. The doctors could go to hell. A young man approached from the road. College age, wearing a jacket too light for the weather. Carrying a clipboard and that earnest expression of someone on a mission. Mr. Crow? Elijah Crow? Depends on who's asking, Elijah said, though everyone in a 50-mile radius knew who he was. I'm Jake Morrison. Graduate student at West Virginia University. I'm doing research on seismic activity in the region, specifically around the old Blackthorn mine complex. Elijah's grip tightened on his coffee mug. Blackthorn 7's been sealed for over 20 years. I know. That's what's interesting. Jake pulled out a tablet, showing graphs and readouts that looked like the world's most boring video game. We've been monitoring microseismic activity in the area. There's something unusual. Pressure readings that don't match geological models. Almost like something's actively stabilizing the region. Mountains settle, Elijah said carefully. Underground structures shift. It's normal. That's what we thought at first. But the patterns are too regular. Too intentional. Jake swiped through more data. It's like someone's been reinforcing weak points. Redirecting underground water that would cause erosion. It's been going on for years, maybe decades. We can't explain it. Elijah said nothing. Sipped his coffee and watched the tree lean. And there's something else, Jake continued, his voice dropping like he was sharing a secret. Local reports. Sightings near the old mines. Always before any kind of seismic event or structural issue. Witnesses describe a large winged creature. Red eyes. The descriptions match historical accounts of the Mothman from the 1960s. The Mothman's a legend, Elijah said. A story people tell. Nothing more. But you were there, Mr. Crow. You survived the Blackthorn 7 collapse. The official report says you were alone, but there are inconsistencies. Witnesses who saw unusual tracks at the scene. Emergency responders who reported strange findings that were later redacted. What really happened in that mine? Elijah looked at this young man with his tablets and his theories and his earnest belief that the universe owed him explanations. Reminded him of himself at that age, before Samuel died, before he learned that some truths are too heavy to share. I'll tell you what happened, Elijah said slowly. A mountain nearly killed a town. I got lucky and survived. And I learned that the real monsters aren't the things we can't explain. They're the men who value profits over people. Who hide safety reports and gamble with workers' lives. That's what really happened. But the creature. Son, I'm an old man with bad lungs and worse memories. You want my advice? Focus on the real problems. Monitor those seismic readings. Make sure the current mines are safe. Let the legend stay legendary. Jake looked disappointed but nodded. Thanked Elijah for his time. Walked back toward his car parked down the road. When he was gone, Elijah allowed himself a small smile. Finished his coffee. Stood with the creaking joints of a man who'd earned every year of his age. He looked toward the ridgeline, toward the dark shape of the mountains against the darker sky. And he thought, as he often did, about red eyes in the darkness. About sacrifice without recognition. About the kind of heroism that happens in shadows where nobody will ever see it. "You're still out there," Elijah said quietly to the wind. "Still trying. Still saving people who'll never know they needed saving. You stubborn, brave son of a bitch." The wind picked up, rustling through the bare trees. And for just a moment, just the briefest instant, Elijah could have sworn he saw something on the distant ridge. A silhouette. Wings spread wide against the stars. Red eyes like distant warning lights. Then it was gone, if it had ever been there at all. Elijah went inside. Locked his door. Made sure the fire in his small stove was banked for the night. Lay down in his bed and closed his eyes. Outside, in the darkness that covered the Appalachian mountains like a blanket, something moved. Something that had been moving for decades. Centuries maybe. Time works differently for creatures that exist outside normal biological categories. The Mothman had never stopped his work. Would never stop. Each tunnel he reinforced. Each structural weakness he identified. Each warning he tried to give to people who rarely listened. It was exhausting. Thankless. Sometimes he wondered why he bothered. Then he'd remember a night in 1967. A broken man who'd learned to see past fear and hatred. Who'd been willing to die to save people he'd never met. Who'd kept his promise for over 2 decades, fighting for safety and prevention in the unglamorous ways that actually mattered. The creature spread his wings, now fully healed from that long-ago injury. Tested the air currents. Prepared for another night of endless vigilance. Because that's what you do. When you can see tragedy coming. When you have the power to prevent it, even if no one believes you, even if they blame you, even if they hunt you. You keep trying. You keep fighting. You don't give up. That's not being a monster. That's being a hero. The Mothman took flight, disappearing into the darkness between the stars and the earth. Heading toward another mine. Another disaster waiting to happen. Another chance to save lives that would never know they were in danger. And behind him, in a trailer in Colville, an old miner slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Dreaming not of collapsing tunnels or lost brothers, but of red eyes watching over the darkness. Guardian. Protector. Friend. The seismic monitoring stations around Blackthorn 7 continued their work. Recording data. Noting anomalies. Never quite explaining the patterns they saw. The pressure readings showed continued stability in areas that should have collapsed years ago. Geological models couldn't account for it. Some scientists theorized about unknown mineral deposits creating natural reinforcement. Others suggested their models were incomplete. A few, very quietly, suggested something else might be at work. Those suggestions never made it into official reports. In Colville and the surrounding communities, life continued. Miners still descended into the earth each day. Some came home safe. Some didn't. But the numbers had improved. Safety regulations had teeth now. Companies faced real consequences for negligence. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was better than it had been. And that mattered. The Mothman sightings never stopped entirely. Every few years, someone would report seeing something with wings too large and eyes too red near one mine or another. Near bridges. Near chemical plants. Near anywhere disaster might strike. Most people dismissed the reports. Called them hoaxes or misidentifications or attention-seeking. Some believers kept detailed logs, building elaborate theories about this mysterious creature's purpose and origin. The truth, as usual, was simpler and stranger than either group imagined. There are things in this world that don't fit our categories. Don't match our expectations. Things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we can explain. The Mothman is one of those things. Not demon. Not angel. Just a creature doing what it was built to do, whatever cosmic lottery created it, whatever strange evolutionary path led to its existence. Warning. Protecting. Trying desperately to be heard by a species that rarely listens. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone does listen. Someone sees past the fear and the strangeness to understand what's really happening. Those moments are rare. Precious. Worth the decades of failure and frustration. Elijah Crow was one of those people. A man who transformed hatred into understanding. Vengeance into purpose. Personal tragedy into systemic change. He never told the full story of what happened in Blackthorn 7. Took that secret to his grave when he died in his sleep in 1997, age 68, his damaged lungs finally giving out. But the effect of that secret rippled outward. Every miner who came home safe because of regulations Elijah helped pass. Every disaster prevented by safety measures he fought for. Every family that didn't have to bury a father, brother, son because the system had changed, just slightly, just enough. That was the real story. Not the monster. Not the legend. The quiet work of prevention. The unglamorous heroism of changing systems. The simple truth that saving lives matters more than getting credit for it. The Mothman understood that. Had always understood it. That's why he kept trying. Kept warning. Kept protecting. Even when no one believed. Even when they hunted him. Even when every instinct screamed to give up and let humanity face the consequences of its own ignorance. Because some things are worth doing even when they're impossible. Some battles are worth fighting even when you know you'll lose more than you win. Some lives are worth saving even when they'll never know they were in danger. That's the lesson at the heart of this story. Not about monsters or legends or paranormal phenomena. About purpose. About perseverance. About the kind of courage it takes to keep trying when nobody's watching, nobody's grateful, and success looks like nothing happening at all. The Mothman continues his work. Somewhere in Appalachia, or maybe farther afield, wherever his instincts lead him. Watching for structural weaknesses. Sensing disaster before it strikes. Trying to warn whoever will listen. Most people don't listen. Most people never will. But some do. And for those few, that moment of understanding changes everything. The story of Elijah Crow and the Mothman isn't really about what happened in a mine in 1967. It's about what happens afterward. The slow work of redemption and prevention. The unglamorous heroism of everyday safety. The truth that enemies can become allies, monsters can be misunderstood, and the real demons are usually wearing suits and ignoring safety reports. It's about the fact that tragedy is not inevitable. That disasters can be prevented. That someone somewhere is always trying to warn us, and maybe, just maybe, we should start listening. Because the Mothman was never the enemy. The enemy was always the silence before tragedy. The willful ignorance. The profit-driven negligence. The refusal to hear warnings until it's too late. And the hero? The hero was an angry miner who learned to see past his grief. Who transformed hatred into understanding. Who kept a promise to a creature that saved his life by spending the rest of his life saving others. That's the real story. That's what matters. Everything else is just darkness and red eyes and the eternal question of what moves in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. The answer, it turns out, is simpler than we thought. What moves in those spaces is the same thing that moves in all of us when we're at our best. The stubborn, thankless, beautiful impulse to protect. To warn. To save. To keep trying, even when it's impossible. Especially when it's impossible. That's not a monster. That's not a demon. That's something we should maybe, finally, start calling by its real name. A guardian. A sentinel. A creature that cares about human life even when humans don't care about themselves. The Mothman doesn't need our belief. Doesn't require our gratitude. Will keep doing his work whether we acknowledge it or not. But maybe, just maybe, it's time we stopped running from the red eyes in the darkness. Stopped calling warnings curses. Stopped shooting at the things we don't understand. Maybe it's time we started listening. Because somewhere tonight, in some tunnel or on some bridge or near some structure that's about to fail, those red eyes are watching. Trying to warn. Trying to save lives that may never know they were in danger. And that, ultimately, is the point of this whole story. Not the creature. Not the legend. The warning. Listen to the warnings. Believe in prevention. Value the quiet heroes who work in darkness and never ask for recognition. Fix the systems that put profits over people. Don't wait for tragedy to force change. That's what Elijah Crow learned in the darkness of Blackthorn 7. That's what he spent the rest of his life teaching anyone who would listen. The Mothman was never the harbinger of death. He was the harbinger of ignored warnings. The physical manifestation of preventable tragedy. A reminder that walks on wings that disasters don't just happen, they're allowed to happen by people who should have known better. And if we're very lucky, if we're very smart, if we finally start listening to the warnings instead of shooting the messengers, maybe the Mothman can finally rest. Maybe he can stop his endless vigil. Stop trying to save people who refuse to be saved. Stop carrying the weight of tragedies he couldn't prevent because nobody would listen. But until that day comes, he'll keep flying through the darkness. Keep watching for danger. Keep trying to warn us. Because that's what heroes do. Even when they're called monsters. Even when they're hunted and feared and blamed for the very disasters they're trying to prevent. They keep trying. They don't give up. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Mothman. The real reason his legend persists. Not because he's frightening. Because he's everything we should aspire to be. Persistent. Protective. Willing to sacrifice recognition for the sake of doing what's right. In the mountains of West Virginia, in the darkness between the stars and the earth, the Mothman flies on. Red eyes scanning for danger. Wings spread wide against the night. Forever vigilant. Forever trying. Forever misunderstood. And somewhere, in whatever comes after life, Elijah Crow watches and knows that the promise was kept. That the work continues. That some debts can never be fully repaid, but the effort matters anyway. The enemy became the savior. The monster became the guardian. The warning became the lesson we're still trying to learn. Listen to the red eyes in the darkness. They're trying to save your life.